The snow fell like silent ash that night, soft and endless, covering everything that had once held warmth. It drifted through the spruce trees, settled on the roofs of Fairhope's handful of homes, and swallowed the sound of anything human. The town sat like a frozen memory at the edge of nowhere, cut off from the rest of Alaska by miles of white wilderness. Winter had a way of silencing truth there. It froze screams before they could reach a door, buried tracks before anyone thought to look, and turned secrets into ghosts. That was why, when Clara Baines vanished, the town didn't panic. They whispered instead in the aisles of the grocery store, in the low hum of the diner, and in the hollow crackle of police radios that no one wanted to answer. Clara had been the kind of girl who left warmth behind wherever she went. She worked part-time at the cafe by the dock and smiled at everyone like she'd known them all her life. 23 years old, restless and bright, she was the kind of person who didn't seem meant for a town that small. People said she was planning to leave for Anchorage come spring, that she'd been saving for a one-way ticket out of the snow. But spring never came for her. The night she disappeared, Fairhope was celebrating its annual winter festival, the only thing that broke the monotony of the dark season. Lanterns lined the frozen lake, bonfires burned against the black sky, and the air smelled of smoke and cider. Clara had been there, dancing in her red scarf and laughing with her friends. There were pictures, grainy ones from old phones capturing her spinning in the snow. Around 9, she told her friend Ellie she was heading home. It was barely a 15-minute walk through the woods to her cabin on Birch Road. She never made it. Sheriff Nolan Graves had been on duty that night, sitting in his office with the radio murmuring low and the coffee long gone cold. He'd lived in Fairhope most of his life, and the town had grown around his silence. He wasn't a man who talked much, and when he did, people listened. His wife had died years ago. His son had moved south, and what remained was a man who wore his badge like a wound he couldn't stop reopening. When the call came in about Clara, something in him tightened. Missing persons weren't rare up there, not with the weather, the isolation, the wilderness that could swallow a man whole in an hour. But this felt different. By the time Nolan and his deputy, Annie Ross, reached the lake, the snow was falling thick, erasing everything. The last people who saw Clara said she'd left the festival laughing, the red scarf trailing behind her like a flare. They found her footprints leading toward the woods, light and hurried, as though she'd been trying to beat the storm. Then halfway down the trail, the print stopped. No sign of a struggle, no other tracks, just the clean, undisturbed surface of snow stretching out endlessly ahead. It was as if the earth had swallowed her. The search began before dawn. Men and women trudged through the woods with flashlights and dogs that howled into the stillness. Helicopters came from Juneau 2 days later, scanning the frozen land, but the snow had already done its work. There was nothing left. No scarf, no blood, no sign of life. Just the kind of silence that sank into your bones and stayed there. Fairhope went quiet after that. The laughter at the diner dulled. The music at the bar stopped, and even the children avoided the woods. But what lingered most was the unease, the sense that something unseen was watching, listening. A week passed before Nolan began to feel it too, that creeping certainty that this wasn't just another missing person. He'd been reviewing reports late one night, surrounded by maps and faded photos, when the sound of tires crunching snow broke through the silence. He went to the door expecting to see Annie, but the lot was empty. Just snow swirling in the headlights of his truck. Then he noticed the small red envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a single piece of paper folded twice. No address, no signature, no fingerprints. The message was written in uneven red ink, letters pressed hard enough to tear the page. She's not the first. Nolan stared at the note for a long time, the hum of the heater filling the room. He turned it over, held it to the light, even smelled the paper. Nothing. The handwriting wasn't familiar. He thought about taking it to Anchorage for forensics, but something stopped him. He'd seen messages like this before, or rather, he'd seen what they led to. Wild goose chases wasted time, and people who wanted attention. Yet there was something about the note that didn't feel like a prank. It felt personal. He slipped it into his desk drawer and locked it, but even as he tried to focus on paperwork, the words stayed with him. She's not the first. That night he dreamed of the lake. In his dream, the ice was black and slick, and beneath it were faces pressed against the glass, their eyes wide and blue. He woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of wind howling outside like laughter. He tried to shake it off, but when he got to the station the next morning, Annie was waiting with a file in her hands. "I pulled the old records like you asked," she said, setting it down. "You might want to see this." He opened it, frowning. The first page was a missing persons report from 6 years earlier. A hiker named Lauren Keating who vanished near the same woods. The second was a logger from 2018. Then another and another. 7 people in total, all missing during the same week in January, all near Lake Hauser. Nolan leaned back, rubbing his temples. Why didn't anyone connect these? Different jurisdictions, Annie said. No one ever compared them. Different names, different reasons. But look at the dates, he did. Each disappearance had occurred within days of the others, almost to the exact date each year. The most recent before Clara's had been 11 months ago. The air in the office felt colder suddenly. Nolan didn't believe in coincidences, not in places like this. He stared at the map on the wall. The sprawl of white and black lines, the frozen wilderness that surrounded Fairhope like a graveyard. "Someone's been doing this a long time," he said quietly. Annie hesitated. "You think Clara's connected?" "I think she's not the first," he replied. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the tracks of everything that mattered. The lights of the town glowed dimly against the endless night, and somewhere in the distance a shape moved through the trees. It could have been wind. It could have been something else. Nolan went home that night and stood by the window for a long time, staring at the whiteness pressing against the glass. He thought about Clara's red scarf, how bright it must have looked against all this emptiness. He thought about the faces of the missing, frozen in photographs that no one had looked at in years. He thought about the note. He didn't know then that the message was only the beginning. He didn't know that beneath all that snow the ground was restless, that it held more than just frozen soil. He didn't know that every whisper of wind carried a name, and that the storm outside his window was not weather but something else entirely. In Fairhope, the snow never melted completely. It only waited. The next morning began gray and silent. The kind of silence that makes even footsteps sound guilty. The cold had sunk deeper overnight, turning Fairhope into a place where breath came out in small clouds and sound refused to travel far. Sheriff Nolan Graves sat alone in his office. The file of disappearances spread out in front of him like a confession he didn't want to read. 7 people gone without a trace. Each one lost in January, each one near Lake Hauser. It wasn't a coincidence. He could feel it like a pulse under his skin. Annie came in holding 2 mugs of coffee, her face pale from lack of sleep. She had been with the department for only 3 years, but she had seen enough to know when a case didn't make sense. "You've been up all night," she said, setting 1 mug beside him. "Couldn't sleep," Nolan replied, his voice rough. "Kept thinking about that note." "She's not the first," Annie recited quietly. "If that's true, whoever wrote it knows something." Nolan nodded, staring at the wall map again. Tiny red pins marked the last known locations of each missing person. They formed an arc around the northern side of the lake, like the outline of something buried. He traced it with his finger. Every single one of them disappeared near this stretch. "You see this line here? That's the old hunting grounds. Haven't been used in years." Annie leaned closer. "Didn't that property belong to Harold Dent? The trapper who lived up there?" "Yeah," Nolan said. "Used to bring in pelts every winter. One year he just stopped showing up. Folks figured he froze to death or moved south. There was never a body, was there?" "No," Nolan admitted. "Just stories. The name lingered in the air like frost. Harold Dent had been one of those local legends, part man, part myth. A recluse who lived deep in the woods, known for his silence and his dogs that were said to howl only at night. Children used to dare each other to sneak up to his cabin. None ever did. Annie crossed her arms. You think this could be him? After all these years? I think it's a place to start. By noon, they were driving north. The sky was a pale smear of silver, the trees ghostly white as the wind carried flurries across the road. The truck heater rattled but couldn't keep up with the cold. Annie stared out the window as the wilderness thickened, the sense of isolation growing heavier with every mile. There were no houses out here, no power lines, just endless forest and snow that swallowed everything. You ever notice, she said softly, how quiet it gets the deeper you go? Too quiet, Nolan said. They reached the edge of Lake Hauser just as the light began to fade. The frozen surface stretched out like glass, smooth and black beneath a skin of ice. The trees around it leaned in, their branches heavy with snow, their shadows long and sharp. Somewhere far off, a raven croaked, its voice harsh against the stillness. They left the truck and walked the rest of the way, their boots sinking into the powder with muffled crunches. The old trail was barely visible, more a memory than a path. It twisted through the forest until it reached a clearing that hadn't seen footprints in years. There, half buried under a sagging roof of snow, stood the cabin. The place looked abandoned at first glance, the logs gray with rot, the windows frosted opaque. But when Nolan pushed open the door, the smell that hit him wasn't decay, it was heat. Faint but unmistakable. Someone had been here recently. Annie raised her flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark. Dust drifted in the air, catching the light like ash. The interior was small. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a shelf with cans long past expiration. Everything coated in neglect. But in one corner, the dust was disturbed. Footprints, fresh ones. Nolan crouched beside them, touching the damp outline. Still wet, he murmured. Whoever was here left less than an hour ago. Annie's light trembled slightly. You think they're still close? Maybe. They moved deeper inside. The kettle on the stove was hissing softly, a thin wisp of steam curling up into the stale air. Nolan's heart began to beat faster. He reached out, turning off the flame, and that was when he heard it, a whisper, barely there, like breath brushing against glass. He froze, listening. The sound came again, faint but real, from behind the closed door at the back of the cabin. Annie's hand went to her holster, and Nolan motioned for silence. Slowly, he reached for the door and pushed it open. The smell of cold earth rushed out. The room beyond was small, the walls covered in newspaper clippings and photographs. Some were yellowed with age, others recent. Every face was familiar. The missing. Lauren Keating, Henry Mathers, Clara Baines. Each photograph had a red X drawn through it, except for Clara's. Hers hung in the center, untouched, pinned above a crude map of the lake. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint creak of the wind outside. Jesus, Annie whispered. Nolan stepped closer, scanning the wall. There were numbers scribbled beside each face, coordinates maybe, or dates. He took a photo from the wall and studied the handwriting. It matched the note he'd received. The same jagged pressure, the same crimson ink. This is him, Nolan said quietly. Whoever's doing this is his workroom. But why leave it like this? Annie asked. Why not hide it? Nolan looked around, his instincts prickling. Maybe he wanted us to find it. A sound came from outside then, soft, deliberate. Not wind, footsteps in the snow. They both turned, moving to the front of the cabin. The door was open wider than before, swinging gently. The world beyond it was a blur of white and shadow. Nolan stepped out, gun drawn, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Then came the faintest flicker of red between the trees, a scarf fluttering from a branch. Clara's. He moved toward it slowly, each step sinking deep into the snow. The fabric was stiff with ice when he touched it. There was blood on one edge, dried to a dark brown. Behind him, Annie called his name, but her voice sounded far away. He looked deeper into the woods and saw something move just for a second. A dark figure slipping between the trees. Tall, deliberate, silent. He raised his gun, but the figure was gone before he could blink. Only the wind remained, curling through the forest like laughter. They spent another hour searching the area, but there was no sign of anyone. No new tracks, no footprints except their own. It was as if the snow itself had erased the intruder the moment he vanished. When they returned to the cabin, the wall of photos was gone. Every picture, every clipping, torn away clean, leaving only blank boards behind. Nolan stood in the doorway, the unease deepening into something colder than fear. He was here the whole time, he said quietly, watching us. Annie looked at the floor, her voice shaking. We should get back. Call for backup. Yeah, Nolan said, but his eyes lingered on the empty wall. The silence inside the cabin felt different now. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the kind that hides something waiting to breathe again. As they drove back through the dark woods, the storm began to rise. Snow whipping against the windshield in thick, blinding sheets. The headlights caught flashes of white, branches bending under ice, shapes that could have been anything. Annie clutched the radio, trying to reach dispatch, but all she got was static. Nolan didn't speak the rest of the drive. He couldn't. His mind kept replaying that flicker of red, the whisper behind the door. The sense that something had been standing just beyond the circle of their light. The forest was too still, too knowing. When they finally reached town, the wind followed them, rattling the windows of the station like fingers tapping for attention. Annie locked the evidence they had, the scarf, the note, the coordinates, but Nolan didn't move from the map. He stared at Lake Hauser again, tracing the curve of the shoreline, the arc of disappearances. His reflection in the window looked like a ghost against the snow outside. He could almost see them there, the missing, drifting through the woods, their voices carried on the wind. He didn't know it yet, but the storm that had started that night would never truly stop. It had been waiting for them to look. It had been whispering all along, buried in the snow. And now that they'd heard it, it wasn't going to let them go. The storm arrived without warning. One moment the forest stood silent under the dim gray sky, and the next wind tore through the trees like a living thing, hurling snow sideways and swallowing the world in white. By the time Sheriff Nolan Graves and Deputy Annie Ross realized how bad it was, they were already trapped at the cabin. The radio had gone dead. The roads vanished under feet of snow, and even the headlights of the truck seemed useless against the churning dark. The nearest town was 20 miles away, but it might as well have been another planet. The storm made sure of that. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled weakly in the stove, its glow trembling across the wood walls. The photographs were gone now, stripped away by whoever had been there before. Only the holes where tacks had been remained, tiny black dots scattered like constellations. Annie sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. Nolan paced near the door, his flashlight clutched tightly, his jaw set in silence. Signal's dead, Annie said. I tried all channels. Nothing but static. It's the storm, Nolan replied. We'll wait it out. And if it doesn't stop? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. The storm wasn't natural. It felt deliberate somehow, as if something wanted to keep them there. Hours passed. The wind howled, then quieted, then howled again, a rhythmic rise and fall like breathing. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows thick and heavy, sealing them inside. Nolan checked his watch. Midnight. He hadn't slept in nearly 36 hours, but his mind was too sharp, too alert to rest. The note, the cabin, the faces, they all churned together into a single thread he couldn't untangle. He went to the wall, ran his hand along the wood where Clara's photo had been. She's close, he murmured. Annie looked up. You don't know that. Yes, I do. He turned to her, his voice lower now. "Whoever's doing this, they've been careful for years. Patterns, timing, everything calculated. But this time it's different. He's getting reckless, leaving signs. Leaving us that note. He wants to be found. Or he wants to lead us somewhere," Annie said. "You said it yourself, maybe he wanted us to find this place." Nolan didn't respond. He was staring at the floor now, at the faint, dark stain near the trapdoor they'd barely noticed before. The boards there were warped slightly, as if something had been dragged across them. He crouched, brushing away the dust. A metal latch gleamed faintly in the firelight. "What's that?" Annie asked. "Let's find out." He pried the latch open, the wood groaning as it lifted. Cold air poured out from below, sharp and stale. Beneath the hatch was a narrow staircase carved into the ground, vanishing into darkness. Annie leaned over, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. "There's a tunnel," she said. "Looks like it goes under the hill." "Get your gun," Nolan said. "We're going down." The steps were slick with frost, the air colder the deeper they went. The beam from their flashlights flickered off wet stone, revealing walls scarred with deep gouges. At first Nolan thought they were tool marks, but as he looked closer, he saw fingernail scratches, long and desperate. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. The sound of dripping echoed somewhere ahead, slow and rhythmic. After what felt like forever, the passage widened into a low chamber. Ice hung from the ceiling in translucent spears, and in the center stood a series of shapes beneath the frost. Annie raised her light and her breath caught. Bodies. They were arranged in a circle, upright and frozen solid, their faces pale and glassy beneath the ice. Men, women, even a child. Their eyes were open, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Oh my God," Annie whispered, her voice trembling. Nolan stepped closer, his breath fogging in front of him. "The missing," he said quietly. "All of them." He turned his flashlight toward the far wall and froze. There, among the frozen dead, was Clara Baines. Her red scarf still clung to her neck, stiff with frost. Her expression was different, though. Calm, almost peaceful. Her eyes were open, staring straight at him through the ice. Nolan's throat tightened. He didn't just kill them. He preserved them. Annie swallowed hard. Why? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The reason hung in the silence between them. The same reason killers keep trophies, the same reason hunters mount heads. Ownership. Memory. Power. Then came the sound. A low moan, faint and distant, echoing through the tunnel. Annie spun around, gun raised. "Did you hear that?" "It's the wind," Nolan said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound came again, closer this time, a slow dragging like boots across stone. The flashlight flickered. The darkness seemed to move. Nolan motioned for her to stay back as he stepped forward, his light sweeping across the frozen bodies. The sound stopped. Then suddenly the beam caught something, a reflection in the ice that wasn't his own. Eyes. Human eyes glinting from the shadows behind Clara's body. "Annie," he whispered. Behind her. A shape detached itself from the wall. Tall, broad, wearing the color of snow and shadow. It moved with the deliberate calm of someone who'd done this before. Nolan raised his gun, but before he could fire, the lantern exploded behind him, plunging them into total darkness. The blast of cold air that followed was like being submerged in ice water. Annie shouted, the sound muffled by the wind rushing through the tunnel. Nolan fired blindly, the flash from his gun illuminating glimpses of motion, the glint of metal, the blur of movement, the faces in the ice watching silently. Something hit him hard in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He crashed against the wall, his flashlight clattering to the ground. It rolled once, its beam cutting across the figure now standing over him. The face was hidden behind a cracked mask of frost, but the eyes were unmistakable. Calm, patient, almost kind. "Why?" Nolan gasped. The figure tilted its head as if considering the question. Then it leaned close enough that Nolan could feel the cold radiating from its skin. The voice that came from behind the mask was soft, almost tender. "Because they were mine." The axe came down. The flashlight shattered and everything went black. When Annie came to, she was lying in the snow outside the cabin. Her head throbbed, her breath misting in the frigid air. The storm had stopped. The world was eerily quiet, the sky pale with the first light of dawn. She looked around for Nolan, but there was no sign of him. Only footprints leading from the cabin to the edge of the frozen lake. And then, like before, they simply ended. She stumbled toward the lake, calling his name, but the silence answered back. Something beneath the ice caught her eye, something just below the surface. She knelt, brushing the snow away, her heart hammering. It was a badge. Sheriff Nolan Graves's badge, frozen into the ice. Annie stayed there for a long time, staring into the glassy depths. For a moment she thought she saw a reflection looking back at her. Not her own, but his. Then the wind rose again, whispering through the trees, and she turned and ran. Later, when the rescue teams finally reached the area, they found no trace of Nolan or the killer. The tunnel was gone, sealed by collapse. The cabin stood silent, untouched, as if it had been waiting there for years. But some nights, when the snow falls heavy and the wind comes from the north, the locals say you can still see a figure walking across Lake Hauser, a man in a dark coat moving slowly through the blizzard, his breath fogging the air. They say he's searching for something or someone, and when the wind grows quiet, if you listen carefully, you can hear the faintest whisper from the ice below. A voice that sounds like Nolan's calling out a single name again and again, lost to the snow forever. 3 days later, the storm broke. The air was painfully clear, the kind of cold that cracked skin and made breath sting. The sky was a hollow blue stretched over the mountains, the snow glittering so bright it seemed alive. A search party from Juneau finally reached the site when the roads cleared, their snowmobiles cutting through drifts higher than their shoulders. They expected wreckage, maybe bodies, but what they found instead was stranger. Sheriff Nolan Graves sat outside the cabin, his coat stiff with frost, his eyes open and glassy. His face was calm, too calm. His hands rested on his knees, palms upward, as if he'd been waiting for someone. He was alive. Barely. When the rescuers approached, he didn't move or speak. He didn't seem to notice them at all until one of them touched his shoulder. Then slowly he turned his head toward them, his lips cracked and blue. The words that came out were almost too soft to hear. "He's still out there," he said. "The snow keeps him." They carried him to the helicopter, wrapped in blankets and silence. The flight back to Fairhope was a blur of wind and noise, but Nolan didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, on the white expanse that receded behind them. He didn't speak again. Not when they asked about Annie. Not when they asked about the killer. Not even when they told him that the cabin he'd been found beside had burned to the ground just hours after they pulled him out. No one could explain that fire. There had been no lightning, no footprints leading away. It was as if the snow itself had ignited, consuming everything until only ash and ice remained. The photographs, the tunnel, the bodies, all gone. Only the smell of smoke and the faint outline of something blackened beneath the snow. For 2 days, Nolan lay in the hospital unresponsive. His vitals were stable, but his mind seemed elsewhere. Doctors called it shock. The townspeople called it something else. They said the storm had taken something from him and left something behind. When he finally did wake, his first words were a whisper that sent chills through the nurse who heard them. "Don't dig," he said. "Don't go back." He refused to speak to anyone after that except Annie's father, an old fisherman who came to see him one night. No one knows what was said, but when the old man left, he looked older still, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette in the cold. "Some things should stay buried," he muttered before walking away into the snow. Spring came late that year. The ice on Lake Hauser began to thaw in slow fractures, the sound of it echoing across the valley like distant gunfire. The town tried to forget what had happened. The missing were never found. their names fading from memory like footprints in melting snow. Tourists came back in summer, unaware of the ghosts beneath their feet. The only one who didn't move on was Nolan. He resigned quietly, turned in his badge without ceremony. People saw him from time to time. At the diner, sitting in the back with a black coffee gone cold, or driving out toward the lake when the days grew shorter. He never said where he went, but every winter, without fail, his truck was seen parked near the same frozen stretch of water, sometimes for hours, sometimes all night. When people asked why, he would just say, I'm listening." They said he heard things out there, the wind carrying voices, faint laughter, whispers that came from beneath the ice. He never denied it. Once a young deputy asked him what he meant by, "The snow keeps him." Nolan only smiled, that weary, hollow smile of someone who's seen too much. "The snow remembers," he said. "It covers what it takes, but it never forgets." Years passed, and the story became another local legend. The cabin in the woods became a place parents used to scare their children into obedience. No one went near Lake Hauser after dark. Hunters claimed they heard cries under the wind, and one trapper swore he saw a man's shadow moving through the trees during a blizzard, dragging something behind him. But when he went to look, there were no tracks, just the same clean, untouched snow stretching for miles. By the 10th winter, Nolan had become a ghost himself. He rarely came into town. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of the forest, keeping the curtains drawn and the fireplace lit even in summer. When people did see him, they said he looked older than his years, his eyes distant, his voice quieter. But he still drove that same truck, still made the same pilgrimage every January, always to the lake, always at night. One night, a teenager from town followed him, more out of curiosity than courage. He parked far enough back that his engine wouldn't be heard, and watched Nolan through the drifting snow. The sheriff stood by the frozen lake for nearly an hour, motionless, the moonlight turning him silver. Then, without warning, he walked out onto the ice. The boy held his breath, watching as Nolan stopped halfway across, dropped to his knees, and placed his hands flat against the surface as if listening through it. Minutes passed. Then the wind picked up, and the boy thought he heard something. Voices, faint and layered, rising from below the ice. Nolan looked up suddenly, his face tilted toward the mountains. Then he stood, took one last slow breath, and began to walk farther out. The boy tried to shout, but the sound was stolen by the wind. A crack split the air, a single sharp sound like a rifle shot, and then Nolan was gone. They never found a body. Search teams combed the lake for days, but the ice was thick, unbroken, as if nothing had happened at all. His truck remained where it had been parked, keys still in the ignition, the engine long cold. Inside the glove compartment, they found a notebook, weathered and stained. Most of the pages were blank, except for one near the middle. It held only 4 words, written in that same sharp hand as the note he'd once received. "He never left me." After that, people stopped going near Lake Hauser altogether. The town quieted again, the way small Alaskan towns do when they want to forget. But some nights, when the snow falls thick and the wind carries just right, the old-timers swear they see headlights out there. A truck parked near the frozen water, a figure standing beside it, tall and still, his breath fogging the air. Sometimes there's another figure beside him, smaller, wearing a red scarf. They say if you walk too close, you'll hear voices whispering from the snow, names of the missing, promises, apologies. And if you listen too long, you won't hear the wind anymore. You'll hear your own name carried softly through the cold, asking you to come closer. The locals don't speak of Nolan graves now, not in daylight. But when winter comes, when the first snow falls and the world grows quiet, some still glance toward the lake and lock their doors. Because out here, in the stillness of Alaska's endless night, the past doesn't stay buried. It waits beneath the ice, patient and watching, whispering for company. And if you stand there long enough under that vast and merciless sky, you'll understand what Nolan meant. The snow keeps everything, the voices, the sins, the faces. It covers them gently, hides them from the world. But when the wind stirs, when the air grows thin and the temperature drops, it remembers. It always remembers.